Sundaura. Thank you for starting the recording. Sundaura Alfred Purvis, who I'm sure most of you know, and she will be giving a presentation titled From Landscaping to Land Care. Sundaura is the outgoing executive director of SOL and is a SOL accredited land care practitioner. So take it away, Sundaura. I'll mute myself and turn my camera off.
All right, thank you very much, Kristen. This talk is a little less focused on what I do for SOL and then focused more on the other hats I wear. And it has been sort of a long career arc for me, which I'll go through. But just at the start, I do like to mention that I am joining this event today from Ottawa, Ontario, which is in the unceded lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So from landscaping to land care, I've been gardening for a long time. My journey into the gardening world started early. As we often do as children, we planted seeds one spring. And watching the transformation of something I was able to hold in the palm of my then much smaller hand into a gigantic squash vine was the best magic ever. I was also impressed with the squash themselves. Not enough to actually want to eat them at that age, but really definitely impressed. Once I had encountered it, I had to learn all I could about this thing called gardening. Over time, I checked out every single garden book in the Picton Public Library, many of them multiple times. I learned about all the different plants in those books. I wasn't interested in the Sears Wish Book. I poured over the Rockwood Gardens flyers and the Stokes Seed Catalog and made my wish lists from those instead. My career followed a path through garden centers and greenhouses into garden and landscape design. I received awards for my work and was heavily involved in the professional horticultural and landscaping world. But over the years, more and more of that world was being taken over by concrete and stone. Gardens were becoming less about gardening and more about low maintenance curb appeal, for looking at rather than caring for or having a relationship with. Somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong. This was not that joy and the wonder that had sparked my love of gardening. Even my joy in plants was becoming tarnished by my increasing awareness of how much greenhouse plastic, natural gas heating, peat moss, irrigation, fertilizers, insecticides, plastic containers and tags, and shipping was associated with growing those instant gratification, impulse purchasable, retail-ready plants. I was looking for something else. I just didn't know what it was. I finally found the seed of it in a book, one that, despite being all about plants, was not shelved in the garden section of the bookstore, but in the indigenous section. Plants have so much to give. All we have to do is ask. Anishinaabe Botanical Teachings by Mary Zissib Genius, a book filled with practical and scientific details alongside and on equal footing with teaching stories. Stories of plants as living beings with gifts and abilities that they share with us. A book written from the perspective of a human within nature, rather than viewing nature as a system separate from the human one, of being in relationship with, rather than exerting control over the lives and the ecosystems that surround us and make our lives possible. She described it, that type of connection I'd been looking for in gardening. I had followed the path into horticulture that had been drawn by the industry, trends, and marketing. I hadn't followed the plants. The plants hadn't forgotten how to be in relationship. I had, my ancestors had, my culture had. Horticulture, as we are taught it, is rarely about the plants and their communities and relationships. It's about the showiest, the biggest, the rarest, the most, the best behaved. It's about treating the plants as a material for our artistic and aesthetic expression, of tidying, manicuring, and maintaining our creations in the state that we have decided is the most desirable, with little, if any, understanding or centering of the relationships of those plants. This is what happens when business, competition, and colonization are allowed to shape our relationships. To paraphrase David Graeber, to make something saleable in a living economy, one first needs to rip it from its context. There isn't a lot of profit to be made by selling plants if the local and abundant are as or are even more valuable than the exotic or rare. If gardening was allowed to be about the local network of plants and all the life that they support, gardeners might just go out and gather seeds from asters and goldenrod and fill their gardens with free plants. Much better business to move them to other places, to sell patented cultivars of North American species in Europe and European species in North America, where they need to be sourced from licensed growers rather than from local seed libraries. The role of gardener, if we allow it to be defined by the horticultural industry, is not one of providing care. But we don't have to let the industry define the narrative. We can look to the plants and their relationships for a different story. We can seek out Indigenous teachers who tell the stories of being in relationship with the complex network of life that sustains us. We can look for the ways to offer care and support in return for all that we receive. Humans have always been a keystone species in these ecosystems, have always carried and cared for seeds and tended the spaces those seeds are brought to. There is a lot that those of us from newly arrived cultures can learn from the people who guided the growth and abundance of this place since the retreat of the glaciers. But it isn't about going back to something that once was. Backwards is impossible. From the soil biology to water cycles to the climate, the changes of the last 2.5 centuries can't simply be erased or ignored. The process of healing begins with what exists now and asks, how can we contribute to the cultivation of a thriving network of life going forward? Starting can be as simple as inviting the displaced species back to the land in our care and holding space for the joyful disorder and complex relationships and life cycles that they bring with them. Healing continues when we cultivate curiosity about their lives. Who are you? How do you live? What are your relationships? By following their stories, we can begin to relearn how to participate in complex networks of relationship without trying to simplify or escape them. We can also practice land care by pouring our energy into reshaping our own communities to fit the plant communities of this place, instead of shaping the plant community to suit the human community and society currently occupying it. Plants are generous. If we let them, they will help us reconnect with the joy of chaotic, resilient abundance, of being fully interconnected with the lives that surround and support our own. Nearly 4 decades after planting that first squash seed, after following the path into the garden world as it had been shaped by the industry, I've retraced my steps, returning to the seeds that originally introduced me to the world of plants. I've come back to the place that they first showed me all those years ago. And despite my getting sidetracked for a while, it's still the best magic ever. So what does that look like in practice? At the moment, it looks like planting a lot of seeds of native species and moving them out to my patio for winter stratification. There's about 130 native to Ontario species in that picture. And come spring, once they start to germinate, I'll move them from those dense planting in those pots into trays, and I'll care for them until they're large enough to handle. And then I'll hold a plant sale of low cost, because they're young and small, native to Ontario species in my local community. They'll be sent out to their new homes, wrapped up in slices of leaf bag with labels made of materials collected from the recycling bin. Due to their small size, very little potting soil is needed to grow thousands of seedlings. 100 seedlings can fit in a little clementine box, which is what the picture is there at the top. The pots and the trays get washed and reused to help further reduce the material impact of the services that I offer, because I'm offering this, I'm selling plants, but what I'm really selling is my time and my work. It's a service of caring for and growing those plants is what I'm offering. My micro nursery project is still a work in progress. I'm still making adjustments to process, container sizing, pricing. I'm working on producing more compost to blend with the growing medium, both for the plant health and to reduce the amount of potting soil that I use, because that's my primary input. I'm working to streamline my inventory management and pickup scheduling. But the micro nursery, which is what I've been putting a lot of my time and attention into as I come back around and on how do I care for, and how do I make a livelihood in caring for? It's not just about what I'm doing, though. I'm hoping that the model can start of a micro nursery can start to fill one of the niches in the network of services and products needed for land care to start to become a viable livelihood in my community. Because we can't do everything on our own. For land care to displace landscaping as the norm in our communities, we need a land care community, an interdependent network of complementary service providers. This is just a Facebook group. It's a local one that I started here in Ottawa, and we've got about 100 members now, and it's a local land care community. You too can create a group in your community. And we need lots of people in land care. We need people who are working to draw nutrients out of the current pattern of flow through from agriculture to waste systems, and divert those nutrients from that linear flow back into the soil where they can return to the plants and return to that food cycle. So we need people who are providing compost solutions, whether local or municipal scale. We need people who are familiar with local ecosystems and the plants that are adapted to them and the network of life that relies on the local ecosystems. We need the people who can assemble that initial tapestry of plants that forms the network for a local ecosystem to grow up from. We can't plant full ecosystems in one go, but we can start them. We can lay in the pieces so that they become more complex over time. We need people who are diverting materials from landfills and then upcycling them back into useful products, or just even collecting them and cleaning them and returning them for refilling for things like containers. We need people who can repair, reclaim, and upcycle. We need people gathering, either physically or digitally, sustainable and regenerative products so that people can find them when they're looking for better options than just what they find at a local seasonal pop-up garden center. We need people who can cultivate landscapes that nourish, displacing the impact of processing, packaging, and transporting food that's produced far from where we live. We need people who can guide those responsible for a space, so clients, homeowners. We need the guides for those people who are caring for a space, who can help communicate, and we need people who can help communicate the difference between well cared for and well controlled, which is what has for a very long time been understood as what a garden is meant to be. It's meant to be tidy and controlled, and that's a well cared for garden. So very often when people start to garden, that's what they expect that they're supposed to be doing. We need people who can communicate otherwise and help teach people who are just learning how to engage in care. We need people who can teach and organize activities and gatherings. We need to cultivate land care communities and networks, because just like everyone else in the ecosystems we exist in, we can't survive and thrive in isolation or in monocultures. To nurture a land care livelihood, start with your principles. And there's something you will work out over time. Mull them over, write them down, update them as you grow in your knowledge and expertise and relationship. They will evolve and change as you do, so check in now and then. Winter is a great time to review and redirect, reframe, and also to sort of put some time into, if you notice things that you did during a busy season that didn't quite feel like a good fit, winter can be a time for doing some problem solving and looking for some alternatives or learning new skills, so that when you're back in a busy season, you will have them ready and tend to put them to work. But when it comes to principles, these are some that I'm working with at the moment, and that's not to say they won't be updated and reframed and rephrased again over time. but they're getting to know the life and ecosystem of the land we're partnering with before altering them on any significant scale, working to shape human activities to the land before shaping the land to human activities. And that is very much about teaching and inviting relationship for those who've been for a long time out of direct relationship with local ecosystems. We need to learn how to be in relationship again. It's seeking always to strengthen the network of life of any place that we're interacting with. It's assisting displaced life to return to the land that we're working with. That includes displaced human life. It's respecting and supporting the right of an ecosystem to progress toward complexity instead of working to maintain them at a fixed, simplified state, which is very common in landscaping and horticulture and garden standards these days. Understanding where the materials or energy we work with are drawn from and where they will go if or when they move beyond the site is also important. And that's a lot of work. And just trying to do that work will really help to encourage you, and at least it encourages me to work with what's already on site. It's seeking to always return more than we take and to never take beyond a system's capacity to regenerate. It's also acknowledging that humans are heterotrophs. We cannot photosynthesize, so we must draw our energy from the life of other beings. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of services that can fit within these types of principles. The ones I described barely scratch the surface. Look to what your strengths are. Look at local resources, especially ones currently defined as waste, and local needs. Your niche is where you can find an overlap in those things. Focus on foundation building and on progress. Very often, sustainability and regeneration efforts are undermined either by trying to apply a green surface to an unsustainable structure, or ending up doing nothing at all by insisting on perfection and then just not being able to reach it. So not taking any action to change what's currently preventing you from moving in a healthier direction. Don't grow just for growth's sake. This is something I see lots of businesses struggle with. Find the scale or scope that is healthy and sustainable for you and for the local system. A lot of things that are sustainable in a small scale are not sustainable if they individually grow larger, but a lot of things can be replicated into lots of different spaces. So you can have lots of small pieces that are doing similar things in separate spaces, and that could be very sustainable. But when one corporation, one business tries to grow too big, then usually you stop relying on the abundance or excess, and you end up having to draw beyond that, and stressing systems, stressing human and ecological systems. So don't grow just for growth's sake. Find or start a community of like-minded and complementary people rather than trying to be everything to everyone. There are probably more complementary and like-minded people out there than you might think. In an era where over 10,000 people will join in on an online seminar, which is basically about how important our gardens are for caterpillars, most Doug Talany talks, there are a lot of people who either want to offer or are seeking land care services. Learn from those who got a head start when you're getting started. But once you get started, offer support for those who start after you. Just like in the full living ecosystem, we don't thrive from a business or livelihood standpoint unless our community thrives. Nurturing connections and interdependence leaves us stronger, more resilient, and able to weather the tough spells and the growth spurts that we'll encounter in a healthy way. So, questions?
Thank you so much for that, Sundaura. That was a wonderful presentation. If anyone has any questions, I would invite you to either type them in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask Sundaura. I can kick off this question period with you mentioned that you started a local land care community, and it's a Facebook page that you created, and there's now 100 members of that. What would you say would be the best first step to that? So how could somebody start a local land care community in their own communities? What do you have any advice for that?
I would actually say to start by finding out if there is one, because it might not be sort of a Facebook group, but there might actually already be more going on, and it could be in a bunch of different forms. There could be businesses that are already providing some sort of land care type services. It might be ecological landscaping, it might be regenerative. There's different terms, but look around. Who's in your area who might be providing similar services or complementary services? And then you might also be looking to more volunteer side groups. Like I'm a huge advocate for, we need to find livelihoods in work that heals, because out of 7 days a week, if we spend 5 working in work that causes harm, it doesn't matter how much effort we put in on those 2 days we've got left, we're just going to end up exhausted and still further behind. If we can find work that gives us a livelihood for those 5 days a week that does help heal, then we also end up with space for rest and our own regeneration instead of scrambling all the time. So, but that being said, you will find some really good connections often in volunteer-centered groups. So look for who's already doing something similar, and you will often find that if there isn't already a network, really all it's waiting for is somebody to do the work, starting to create a network. And you can ask people. It might be coffee shop meetings, it might be Zoom gatherings, it might be social media groups of some form. Find out what you'll often find people on some sort of a space. If it's social media, if it looks like everybody's using one type of network or another, go with that one. But yeah, look for people who are already interested, and then make it easy to join in. Just by creating something, inviting people. And I've watched this happen because I learned it when somebody in Ottawa years ago started a landscape designer group. And they literally went through who's all the landscape designers in the city, and we invited them all out for breakfast and pay for your own breakfast at a restaurant. And it started a group that got very active simply because people were seeking a connection. The same goes with people who want to provide land care and work on things to heal the world. You put us in a room and we just get along really well, and we all talk each other's ears off, and it's a nice change from having to convince people. It's sometimes great to get that reinforcement of being around people who are like, yeah, totally, I agree with you, instead of having to always. So often it's just give people a space for some connection and say, hey, let's just do a thing, and just get people in the same space a few times, and it will start to build up pretty organically.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Yeah, I think being able to decide whether or not that already exists and where to find it would be probably the key first step, just because we know those people are out there. It's just making sure that we can connect with them. So no, that's great. And what a great way to kind of connect with like-minded individuals and bounce ideas off of each other and really build something great. I have another question is, I really liked when you mentioned shifting perspective from us fitting into nature, or for shifting it so that we are fitting into nature rather than forcing nature to fit in with us. And I'm wondering, how do you think is the best way to reach out to people that don't have that mindset yet and kind of really work that perspective shift? How do we do that on a large scale?
So a couple things. One of them is the ones who just find that idea just to be like, oh, I don't know, nature's supposed to do what I say. don't sink your energy into them. They're black holes. There's a lot of people though who like the idea of being in relationship with nature and are just doing the garden thing the way they were taught. So it's telling the story of, and that's, it's been interesting because if you follow, Doug Tallamy writes about plants and the importance of plants for supporting all of the caterpillars, basically. And he's been, it's all about pollinators and that, and he's written books on it. He's been working on communicating the information for a couple of decades. And then in the last 3 years, when he wrote a book called Nature's Best Hope. And it was about empowering people and saying, here's the thing that you can do that's important, and here's how to do it. And rather than going and saying, these are all the doom and gloom things and it's desperate and yeah, this has to change, it's saying, it's turn the narrative to actually what you can do is really important, and join in, and we'll get you started on how to do that. People like that. And for any of you who've listened to me speak before, one of my things I like to say is that at its core, sort of gardening and horticulture and landscaping, they're really all just about making spaces that make people feel good. That's the service. I mean, it's all this other stuff around it, but that's the seed at the middle. And if you can tell the story that people want to be part of about actually helping the thriving of a place and the ecosystem that we're in, and that this is important work and it actually matters, that feels really good. And so it stops being about it looking a certain way and actually just skips right past the appearance aspect and goes to the, you can feel really good about this. And I would say it's like you get to save the world and it comes with flowers. That's a pretty easy sell if you communicate it that way. And so it's about telling a story that feels good, that says you can actually feel good about this, instead of you can feel like you did a thing and then people are going to be like, oh, you mow your lawn? No. And I've in selling native plants, I've met an awful lot of people in the last couple of years because they come and pick up their plants, including people who've been lifelong gardeners. And then they've basically gone and they planted a pollinator garden, and then they saw all this life show up in their garden that they'd never seen before. And they've just gone and ripped out all this other garden, and they're ripping out their lawns and they're planting all these native plants. And the amount of enthusiasm and joy when they talk about their gardens is contagious, and they become the proselytizers for this very quickly. So it spreads really fast when you start to sort of flip that narrative in a way that invites people in, as opposed to tells them that you've been doing it wrong all the time, all along.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And that's great to hear. I'm sure that's a great way to connect with like-minded individuals too, is selling your native plants, and the people that are buying them are the ones that are going to be really interested in these initiatives. So that's wonderful. Does anyone else have any questions for Sundaura? You can feel free to either pop them in the chat or unmute yourself.
The other thing I could mention, and I'm just pulling up the right file here. Yes, there it is. Those pictures that I showed with businesses, they're actual businesses, right? They're people who are providing services, the solution providers. So I did just toss a bunch of links in the chat. I don't think I've got all of them there because I had sort of started on that and then got sidetracked. But one of them is actually buffco.ca, that's Backyard Urban Farm Company. That's actually going to be next week's guest, and she's going to talk about actually starting an edible landscape service provision in Toronto. So a lot of times people are like, oh, people don't want that. Yeah, they do. Actually, you can make a business providing the services. And then there's a bunch of other ones here. There's composting services, there's landscape design services, there's landscaping services. People are making their livelihoods providing care services to ecosystems in small urban spaces. So there's work to be done there. And there are more people looking for that work than you might think. If you're coming from the landscaping side, something I figured out a while back is the people who are already at a point of really caring about ecosystem health and biodiversity and are really trying to do all those things don't tend to look for landscaping services, because landscaping services are paving stones and little turf lawns and these really simplified gardens. So if you go and you ask a landscaping company if there's anybody looking for really green services, they'll say no. But if you go out and you start talking to people about these things, they go, yeah, that's what I want to do. How do I do that? So there is a need. It's just not the client base, the customer base is actually different people. So the horticultural industry is kind of going, well, nobody's asking. And I'm like, well, that's because they looked around and you're not doing it. So literally someone here in Ottawa 3 years ago, it's coming up in 3 years, started a wildflower seed library. And oh my goodness, that one's all just volunteer driven, but there's literally tens of thousands of native plants now being grown by local people from locally gathered and locally shared seeds. And at the same time, some of the industry people will be like, there's not that much demand for native plants. I'm like, there's literally people went, oh, well, we'll just do it ourselves.
Wow.
And it's literally up to tens of thousands of seedlings being grown, and the seeds, there's seeds distributed, and people are growing seeds. And winter sowing of like that picture I showed earlier, there's so much of that going on this month around the city, and everybody's posting their pictures of all their salvaged containers and putting all of their seeds out. And it's just huge in how fast it's gone. And at the same time, if I turn around and I talk to people who are professional growers that are not native plant specialists, they'll say there's just not that much demand. And it's like you're marketing to the wrong people.
Yeah, definitely. Wow. No, that's really interesting. That's very cool. Oh.
Any other questions? I recognize a few names in the room, so if anybody's got just general questions as well, feel free to toss them out. But you know that I can just keep rambling about things. I kept my talk short because I thought there might be more questions today. All right, so.
I'll also just let everyone know that these webinars are available on Soul's website, so you can go back if you missed one, or if you were too busy in the thick of the season to catch some of them. They are all available now, so feel free to head on over to our website and catch up on some of the webinars. And if you know of anyone that wanted to come to today's webinar but wasn't able to, this will be up as well. So please feel free to take use of those resources.
Yep, and I'm actually going to share one other resource, which is because when I talk about what I do for my business, I also teach, but the plant side of it is the one I keep mentioning. I have a whole blog because I don't just want to sell the plants. I want other people to grow plants and sell plants from their own, because I do this with my dining room and my little itty bitty 6 foot by 8 foot unheated greenhouse and space on my patio, and with really, really minimal inputs other than my time. You can do this. You can do a micro nursery scale. You might grow like I'm aiming for about 10,000 plants next year, but you can easily grow 1,000 or 2,000 in most sort of small spaces. And that's 1,000 or 2,000 native plants into your community. Somebody does that. But yeah, that's lots of plants into your community that weren't there before. And it doesn't take that many plants before you start to see the shift in the ecosystem. In my little urban yard, I garden at 2 places, a rural place and an urban place, and urban yard, and this is like middle of the city, there's multi-year bumblebee populations that have wintered year after year. I see the queen bumblebees every spring. There's 2 or 3 of them every spring around on the spring blooming trees and shrubs. And then by the midsummer, they're all over all of the daisy type flowers. And then into the fall, they're on the asters and the goldenrods. And then I see the whole population life cycle. I see the big queens. I see the worker population build. I see the queens in the fall. I haven't quite noticed any of the males around, but they are definitely there because there's queens each year. Yeah, there's at least 3 different species of bumblebees and lots of other ones. And again, this is a little urban yard, but because there's native plants, and I leave the litter, they come back year after year.
Wow, that's amazing. We did have one question come in, and it's, do you have any advice on small greenhouses? The question asker is planning to move provinces. So they're currently in Ontario, planning to move to BC. So they don't want to start anything major, but they very much enjoyed this talk. So any advice on how to get started on small greenhouses?
So if you're just looking for something temporary, honestly, you don't need a size of greenhouse, because the little space I use, it's not heated. So it does get cool at night. And so plants don't go out until it's not getting really freezing. And you can mimic a similar level of protection by just having a couple layers of plastic sheeting and some sort of, it can be, I've got some boxes that my husband made for me that sit out on frames that have bird netting on them, and you can toss some plastic over them. But even just things like row cover kits that have the bendable, I get mine from Lee Valley. I know they ship all over Canada. So the little bendable rods, and you can actually put a layer of plastic over and leave the ends a little bit open during the day. And then if it's going to have a cold spell, you can toss a sheet over top of that for the night. So you can get pretty small scale and DIY that you can then fold up and put away year after year. If you're thinking something more substantial, but probably not if you're moving, I would, if I was investing in one, I would invest in one that's got the polycarbonate panels as opposed to the plastic sheeting, because they last a really long time. And I'm very much, if I'm going to buy something made out of plastic, I want it to be a long life plastic. But a good polycarbonate greenhouse will last you a very long time. But ours is actually, we built a shed made out of wood and cedar, and then the front of it we reclaimed windows, and then we put polycarbonate panels on the top. So half of it's a wood shed, or a storage shed, a garden shed, and the other front half, the south facing side, is windows and a clear roof. And I know a lot of plants, when you're growing them, sort of just plug tray size in a space like that, and it does work really well. It surprises a lot of people, as long as you can tend the plants for a few weeks after you get them out into the garden. So make sure that they don't really dry out. Those little itty bitty plants where there's like 150 to 200 in a tray, typical, flat 10 inch by 20 inch flat. The following year, those are full size blooming plants. They grow so fast from seed, and that's been so much feedback from people going, I can't believe how well these plants grew. So you can actually grow a lot of plants in a small space if you can get them out to the garden while they're fairly young. And you don't have to start them really early. If you don't have a greenhouse space, just winter sow, leave them outside until they start to grow, and then you pot them up if you need to, divide them and put them right back outside, so they're already acclimated. So I've sort of split it this year. Some will come in and go under light so I can get them growing on a little bit faster, but about half of them are going to just stay out, and then they'll be the later batch. And that gives me a little bit more breathing room on my potting up. Next thing, you could keep he keeps thinking of questions and I keep answering and before I get some type. Well, that's a good sign. At least I'm trying to cover things fairly well. But yeah, you can grow a lot of plants in a small space, and I've been focusing on native species. I also grow some annuals, which are often, I try to draw North American species, but Ontario doesn't have a lot of fast growing showy annual species because, at least my area, historically forest, didn't have much of a bird cycle, didn't have a lot of annual plants. But I do draw on North American annual species as part of how I build soil in spaces and feed pollinators while perennial ecosystems young. So you can grow a lot of annuals in a small space using a similar process, getting them moved out when they're fairly young. You can grow edible plants as well. That's also, we need edible plants and grown close to home. You can do a micro nursery process for growing tomato plants for your neighborhood. So growing in small amounts in spaces we're already heating instead of heating an additional greenhouse space can be really a way to increase sustainability. And have a little micro nursery project that pays for your gardening habit.
That's excellent. Thank you, Sundaura. And I think with that, if there are no more questions, I think we'll end it there. Lots of thank yous in the chat. So yes, thank you so much, Sundaura. This was a wonderful presentation, some really great ideas to have us thinking about what directions to go in. So this has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll hope to see you next week for our next webinar, and keep in mind that they are on our website. So have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.